Thanks for downloading this episode from Teachers Talk Radio. You can find the full schedule and listen back to all our shows at ttradio.org. Enjoy the podcast.
This is a monthly episode of The Late Show with Teachers Talk Radio. And I'm very excited to announce that we have Matthew Evans as our guest today, and more from him in a few seconds' time. So, first of all, I thought as we're approaching our third or fourth show, I just remind our listeners of the premise, which is about stories. So schools, like anywhere with people in, are full of storytelling animals. It's one of Jonathan Gottschall's phrases. That's humans. And in this show, we share, celebrate, and scrutinize the stories told by fascinating and ordinary people teaching and supporting our schools. So all of us who work in and with schools, we collect memorable stories about moments, people, disasters, triumphs, follies, things that shape our career in education, the moments that sort of define us as we move from stage to stage. Sometimes we tell other stories about our day. We talk about challenges, tragedies, triumphs, humorous moments, and particular people. And then we don't always, because schools are quite frenetic places. So we don't always have time to share. Some of you will have headed on an in-person training course. They're less common now, but hopefully we sometimes get out. And one of the real values of that is just getting the chance to speak with and share stories with other teachers. So that's kind of what we're aiming for here. So we have a conversation with an interesting person, we share stories, and we welcome questions from our listeners as well. So I'm hoping very soon our guest, Matthew, will be able to click the old join as co-host button and then speak. Maybe I can set him up. Let's have a look. While I'm waiting for that to be resolved, what I can do is head slightly early to our a note from our sponsors. So today the show is brought to us by two groups. So first of all, we have Kielo Edu, which is recently a BET award-winning inclusive classroom discussion app where students can instantaneously and simultaneously create an interactive map of a discussion, which can help to deepen their subject knowledge and enhance their critical thinking skills. Over 1 million educators and students are already using Kielo to make the world a more thoughtful place. You can join them and find out more at Kielo, so that's KIALO-edu.com. And as always, the show is also brought to us by John Catt Educational, who publish a range of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. So if you fancy exploring some of the themes we look at, or others in relation to education and pedagogy and research, big ideas in education, visit the John Catt, that's 2Ts, bookshop.com to check out their full range of titles. And if you use the code JCTTR2425, you'll get 20% off your order, however many books that you choose to purchase. Okay. Matthew Evans is a secondary school head teacher, serial blogger, mountain fanatic, and he's recently launched a Substack called 100% Assessment with Professor Becky Allen. His published work includes Leaders with Substance, and then The Next Big Thing in School Improvement, which he co-authored with Becky Allen and a chancellor called Ben White. From September 2025, Matthew will be CEO of the Altherston Trust in the Southwest. So welcome aboard, Matthew. Did I miss anything?
No. Hi, Ben. No, it's Athelston, I think it's pronounced, but I'm still researching the King Athelston. So don't ask me about that.
Okay, so after King Athelston, but I'm not going to ask any follow-up questions, but I feel like once you start, you're going to want to have a story there. You'll have a little something about Athelston and education maybe, but that's for September. So welcome aboard. Thanks for giving up your time this evening to share some of your insights and stories. As always, we have a 3-part show, so we're going to think about a few questions raised by earlier episodes of Classroom Chronicles, and then we're going to explore an area that you're currently thinking a lot about, which is assessment, and then we'll finish with those regular questions about your story in education. So let's get started. So question one is, Martin Griffin, who was on our first show, claims that schools are storytelling factories. What do you make of that?
Well, I think I agree. I'm not sure about the factory. I think I'd probably go for organism rather than factory, which is probably what you
Well, that's
expect
good.
me to say, Ben. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay.
but yeah, stories definitely. So I think the thing about stories in schools is that they either emerge, so people create narratives around things that happen, and those narratives can emerge out of things that happen in the school. Or as a school leader, you can try to create or steer those narratives. So I do think if you don't create and steer the narratives, then they do emerge anyway. And I suppose leadership is partly about taking control of that narrative.
Okay. So our listeners like examples. So I think we've got one nice correction. So I'm going to change my first question. I like the word organism more than factory. And then we have sometimes stories emerge. So I'm interested in an example of a story that has emerged in a school, either your own or one that you've worked with, maybe that was unhelpful. And then you've talked about steering stories, and that sounds interesting as well. So you might have an example of how you could do that.
Okay, so one of the things I think when I started as a head teacher, there were lots of stories. There's a whole back catalogue of narratives that you have to understand quite quickly. So people come up with stories for what's happened, why things have happened, what's fair, what's not fair, and so on. So one that sticks in my mind actually was something I've never quite lived down, that one of my predecessors had given the English department additional non-contact time. So they'd said, teaching English is really hard, and you have loads of marking to do. So it's only
Oh dear.
fair that they have, yeah, I know they were an English teacher. So there might have been a vested interest there as well. So I remember when I started, I thought, well, I don't, I don't think that's like a reasonable way um, to conduct a school. I think everyone should have the same contact time. You could equally, as a PE teacher, say, well, I'm doing fixtures till 6 o'clock every night. So what about me? So I got rid of it. And that narrative around that non-contact time persists to this day, I would say 12 years later.
Wow. Did it affect how you were perceived? So I've got this impression of you're kind of like the time snatcher. So
Yeah,
you joined the school and you've taken away my time, and it was the one thing, I don't know, that allowed
yeah,
me to get my job done to the reasonable standard, etc., etc. Is that what happened?
yeah, definitely. It was like, Margaret Thatcher, milk snatcher.
Yeah, that's what I had
Um,
in my head actually.
yeah, you take something away, you never live it down, and that comes back to haunt you, because whenever a workload discussion comes up, it's like, well, everything would be fine if we had that bit of time back that you took away from us. So as a school leader, these things live with you, and as I say, you inherit this idea of what's happened before and what people think is fair and unfair.
So
Um,
I I don't want to get lost in just our first question, but already here, I think there's this dynamic where, as a leader, we're super busy and we make decisions quite quickly, or sometimes just do things, and then the person to whom the thing is done will often construct quite an elaborate story about our motives and reasons. Is this something that just happens to me?
No, yeah, it's definitely true. And what's really interesting is because I like to think I have my ear to the ground quite a lot. So you, as a head teacher, you have you sort of go to people who you can say, what are people actually talking about? Not when I walk into the room, but what do they talk about when I'm not in the room? So you
Yeah.
have these kind of people, and some of the stuff that gets talked about can be quite bizarre. The interpretation of why something's been done a particular way, or you know, someone on the leadership team might have stood up and said, "We're going to do this, and this is why we're going to do this," and then the conspiracy theories that go on behind the scenes are quite incredible.
Hey, any thoughts on why that happens? Because it's quite a labour-intensive thing for everyone involved. What's making that happen?
Yeah, great question. I mean, partly it's the fault of school leaders, isn't it? Because we're not very good, I think, in education of creating that narrative and reinforcing the narrative. So you often
Yeah.
see this in leadership stuff, don't you? They say you've got to keep repeating the main points of the question. So we're not very good at that, to be fair. But I think there's also an assumption as to the motivations of people in charge of schools. And actually, everyone I've met who has been running a school have got really good motivations. But it's very easy to fill a knowledge gap with assumptions about why people do the things that they do. And we
Yes.
all do that in everyday life, don't we?
And in some ways, whatever my motivation is, if the experience of the decisions I'm making is this chaotic conspiracy, I need to know that, don't I? That's important. It's just what you do next, I guess, is the challenge.
Yeah.
I know I've got my brother works for a kind of large tech organization and in internal communications. And one of his mantras is if you have a message, like a 10-minute message to share with your team, you should spend an hour for every minute of that message to make it really clear. And we just don't have that time, do we? Or
No, we
kind of
don't.
thought
And
space.
it's another factor, isn't it? It's the pressure of time where you don't want to keep people after school for endless meetings. Nobody wants that. But on the other hand, people say we're not getting told what's happening. We're not being communicated with. So you are a little bit between a rock and a hard place in
Okay.
terms of communications, perhaps.
Thank you. I think, again, that we could spend all the time on this question. We're going to move on, but I feel like we have an emerging theme of communication already. But we've got a few curveball questions. And if you think it's a duff question, you can always say we can move on. My last guest, Dan Borman, chemistry teacher and ex-ethical hacker and top of the pop star. But anyway, that's another episode. He said homework is unfair and we don't need it. If you teach well enough, it's unnecessary. You're a head teacher. Do you agree?
You can't leave that one hanging, Ben, about ethical hacker and top of the pop
I know
star.
that's what I'm doing there. I'm trying to build kind of interest in the back catalogue, which we'll share at the end of the show. So
Okay.
I'm gonna leave it there. I'm gonna leave it. I'll
Okay.
tell you afterwards, though. Carry
I'm
on.
intrigued. Yeah, homework. Yeah, I kind of partly agree. So the thing about homework is, of course, it's unfair because some children will go home and their parents will supervise them. They'll check they've done it well. They do all of that stuff, and then some won't. So of course, it is inherently unfair. I think that you've got to think here though about what's the point of homework. So the point of homework is to, I suppose, add to the learning or secure the learning that's taking place in school. So there is an argument to say just do it all in school and that would be fairer. But then there's another bit of this argument, which is about creating good habits. And good habits in study, which many students will need if they continue through to higher education, have to be developed from an early age. And the only way you can do that is to set pieces of work to get students into the habit of initiating, motivating themselves, and doing all of that kind of stuff. So I think we've got to be really careful before we assume that the only purpose of homework is to supplement the learning that's taking place in school.
And maybe an example of one of those things you meddle with at your peril, because it links to all kinds of other bits, doesn't it, of school life? So who knows?
Yeah. I mean, we've talked before at great length, haven't we, about those kind of unexamined regularities, and we don't always understand the reason something.
Okay, so our next question is again links to one of our previous episodes. I think Matthew's back now. It was last week's show, actually, or last month's show. Again, Dan Borman, the science teacher, says it's become really hard to teach science in the current political climate. So he was very careful to say it's multiple political figures, but there was a little bit of a Donald Trump theme and some of this anti-scientific rhetoric that's coming out. He said it makes it harder to teach the scientific method. And I wondered, now we have a head teacher in on the show, whether anything else has become more challenging about being a school in recent years. And I'm just waiting for.
Yeah, I think I'm here.
Fantastic.
Can you hear me?
You're
okay?
back. You are back. Yeah, no problem.
I am. I'm going to stay in this position then.
Okay, no worries.
Yeah. So yeah, I've not got a lot to say. I suppose social media is the big thing that has made it more difficult to teach or to run a school. everything you say now gets crawled over by social media. So parents will talk about the school, kids will talk about school, kids will bully each other. Um, they fall out. They then come into school and fall out back in school. So social media, I think, has really changed schools completely.
And just for listeners, awareness, I don't tell Matthew what to say ahead of time, but it turns out that in our next show, I'm speaking with Damien McBeath, who is a head teacher who's maybe better known for his work on the eliminating smartphones from school. So we can probably explore that more in a month's time. So thanks for setting that up, Matt. That's really helpful. I think it's time to get into your current area of interest. So I've worked with Matt a little, so on a book we wrote a few years ago, and I've been impressed at how he maintains a demanding day job and still writes and thinks a huge amount. I know you're thinking a lot about assessment at the moment, so we're going to ask some questions about that. And I thought we'd start with a really simple one, which is, what's the point of assessment in schools? That's where we're going to start.
Yeah, it's a question I've thought a lot about in recent years, mostly talking to Becky Allen about this at great length. The problem, I think, is in education is assessment has come out of psychometricians, hasn't it? So it's come out of people who are really interested in measuring what they think goes on inside people's heads, and that's where the disciplines come from. But as a teacher, I'm only partly interested in that. And what I mean by that is it's important to me that I can make inferences about what children know, but there's a kind of so that argument within it as well. So why do I want them? Why do I want to get inside their heads and kind of know what they know? It's so that I can teach differently, or so that I can fill the gaps, or so that, and so on and so forth. So as a practitioner, the point of assessment has got to be to improve learning. And if that's the objective, rather than the short-term objective of just making inferences, then we can start to think much more broadly about how assessment affects learning.
So I think that's where we need to go further, isn't it now? So we're saying sometimes the use of assessment can be a bit unclear, that we need to think about the relationship between an assessment and learning. So can you tell us a bit more about your understanding of how assessments do affect learning? Because I'm assuming there's a lot there.
Yeah, there is. So to keep it simple, essentially, I think there are three, let's call them mechanisms or routes by which assessment affects learning. So the first one is the one we think a lot about, which is via making inferences. So we set a piece of work, we do a test, we do some marking, we make an inference about what students know or don't know, and then we do something with that information. So we tell students, you've done well or you've not done so well. We're going to get clearly into stories here. We tell the parents maybe that how they've done. We might feed that back into our assessment system and say, actually, maybe we didn't teach that topic as well as we should have done, so we need to change teaching. And in the literature, this is generally known as washback or sometimes backwash. So we've got this mechanism via inference, and this is what happens after the assessment. But I think there are two other really important mechanisms. One is the testing effect, which I'm sure your listeners would already know a great deal about. So by being assessed, we are retrieving knowledge, we're improving memory, and so forth. But the third one, I think, is the most interesting. And Becky and I call this the expectation of inference. And the expectation of inference is when you tell students that they are going to be assessed, how does that change their behavior? And teachers rely on this a great deal without thinking about it. So if you can think in the classroom, you say, right, kids, we're going to have a test next week. It's going to be on these topics. This is what how I'm going to mark it. The marks are going to be shared with your parents or put up on a board or whatever is going to happen to them. And you set this expectation in the child's mind that they are going to be judged. And what's interesting is how that affects what they do next.
Is that so? I've taught quite a lot in selective schools where students are on average well supported and they have made it into the school because they have met certain levels in kind of academic assessment, sometimes I feel like that became a teaching method where you could just say there's going to be a test on this thing, and the majority of students would go away and learn said thing, and then that was it. But it also is a bit unfair, isn't it? So is that dynamic inherently unfair, or am I misunderstanding that?
It is kind of a teaching method, isn't it? Because one of the things we do as teachers is try to motivate students to study productively. And assessment is almost used, in those sci-fi films, Ben, where I think it is like in the Mars film that came out recently, where they kind of slingshot around. They do it in Star Trek too, don't they? So they need to
Yeah,
get somewhere. So they use the gravitational pull of a planet or a star to slingshot around and accelerate the spaceship.
and then travel
So
in time in Star Trek. That's my understanding
yeah,
of
often
it.
of
Yeah, yeah,
warp speed,
yes,
all of that
yeah,
kind of thing.
yeah.
So I think if you take that as a metaphor, teachers often use assessment to kind of accelerate students' attention, effort, motivation to actually get them to study and to learn. And a lot of teachers will deliberately punctuate the learning with regular assessments so that they get these kind of bursts of energy and bursts of acceleration. So in that sense, it's like a tool in the teacher's toolkit. And if you look at assessment like that, it's not just therefore a way of making inferences about learning, it's also a way of motivating productive effort.
So it's going to displace, I think that's the language sometimes used, other activity, because it becomes important for that student in that moment. So I'm thinking there's ways of doing that well and badly. So if I've decided that this is a mechanism I want to make use of in my teaching, sometimes I will forget that. And if I don't tell the students about a test until the day before, I've wasted that because it's
Yeah.
a bit late. So that's that. And then in my head, I think it's important to give them a how. So if I'm going in 2 weeks' time, we're going to do a test on this thing. Am I right in thinking I'm going to boost the engagement in useful study if I say to prepare, you could do these concrete things? Or is it better for me just to not meddle and just mention it? What do you
Hi secondary school teachers, we're Apps for Good, and we give schools like yours free introductory computing courses. Our courses are for everyone, including those who aren't computing teachers, and they're fully equipped with resources mapped to the UK computing curriculums. Independent learning is central to our courses. Your students will develop essential and digital skills by working in teams to create prototype apps. We'll even connect you with industry volunteers to give real-world feedback. Let's empower every young person you teach to shape their future with technology. Speak to us at www.appsforgood.org.
Did you know that every year, half of disadvantaged children who are top attainers at primary school don't go on to achieve top GCSE maths results? At Axiom Maths, we exist to change that. Our fully funded programme helps schools nurture young mathematicians through weekly face-to-face maths circles, where pupils tackle challenging and exciting problems outside the national curriculum. With just under £3,000 annual funding, expert training and quality resources, we give schools everything they need to inspire the next generation of mathematical thinkers. Want to make a difference? Visit axiommaths.com today and join over 400 schools delivering maths circles across the UK.
Meet 2025 BET Award winner Kialo EDU, the 100% free tool for thoughtful, inclusive classroom discussion. On Kialo, students contribute instantly and simultaneously to create an interactive map of a discussion, deepening their subject knowledge and enhancing their critical thinking skills. Set tasks, track participation, and provide personalized feedback in just a few clicks. And since it's compatible with all your favorite LMS platforms, it slots seamlessly into your existing workflow. Over 1 million educators and students are already using Kialo to make the world a more thoughtful place. Join them today at kialo-edu.com.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
And we're only on the first question because when asked what the point of assessment, Matthew really helpfully introduced 3 key aims of assessment or uses or mechanisms. So the first one is inferences. So we use that assessment to make a decision about something, be that a grade, an output, action we take with future lessons. Then there's the much repeated testing effect. So the act of doing an assessment can be of educational or learning value. And then we were just digging into something, I think the wording was expectation of inference. So if I think someone's going to make an inference about my ability in a particular subject, so I know a test is coming, then that might change my behavior. So that's where we got to so far. Was that a reasonable summary, Matt?
It is, Ben, and I'm now sat right by the Wi-Fi.
This is good. No problem. It's all good. All good tests for my podcasting skills. So
yeah.
So we were there. Can you complete the last thing you were saying? Because I did slightly lose the thread. I have to be honest.
Okay, sorry. So I was talking about how much you tell students about what's going to be on a test, for example.
Okay.
So if you say that anything could be on the test, it isn't very motivating. If you tell them exactly what's going to be on the test, it's not very motivating. So there's a kind of sweet spot where you give them enough information so that they think it's within their grasp to do well, and it's worthwhile studying, and they've got a broad idea of what they've got to study, and it gives them that chance of success. So if you think of that as that kind of hill shape, no information, not very motivating, too much,
okay,
not very motivating, and then you've got the sweet spot in between.
Okay, so then for teachers listening, we've got a test in a couple of weeks. A bad approach, well, obviously depends probably on context. If I say we've got a test on everything, be ready, that's no good. If I say the test is just on this single thing, the answer is this. Again, no motivation, somewhere in the middle. That's what we're aiming for.
Yeah, exactly. And you've got a similar thing with study techniques. So if we want students to study productively, we do need to teach them what productive looks like.
Yes.
And if we think of it like just training students up to be productive, this goes back to that homework question, doesn't it? It's getting students into good habits so that the effort they need to expend to do well is reduced. So the investment they make is less, and making sure that they value then the reward as well. So you've got that kind of motivational idea that they want to do well, they know how to do well, and you make it relatively easy for them to engage and be successful.
Thank you. That's really helpful. We're going to come back to the inferences question in a moment, but I've had a number of listeners to the show and then some of the writing that comes after it kind of talk about AI and how that is changing the ground around us in schools. How does AI come into the world of assessment? So where is it going to change things significantly, do you think? Is there an angle we need to think about? Is something we need to start preparing for?
Yeah, I think it's going to change things a lot, and possibly already is. Because one of the really interesting things about artificial intelligence in assessment is that it enables a machine to be adaptive to the student, to the person who's doing the assessment. So if you can imagine the one-to-one kind of Viva example, whereby you can ask an individual person any questions you like about a topic, and then the questions you ask will be responsive to what they tell you, so that if they don't appear to know very much, you could ask them clarifying questions. If they seem to know the stuff you want them to know, you can dig deeper. So what we can't do in classrooms, because we've got generally 25, 30 kids in front of us, is we can't be that responsive in our assessment. We tend to give them a one-size-fits-all assessment approach. What AI can do is it can be responsive, and it can take a whole group of people, but treat them as if they're having individual assessments and really get into what they actually know.
So again, this might be something we need to revisit in future shows, because it sounds like it's not just AI speeds up the way that things are now. AI presents a different way of gaining more individual and high definition inferences about what students do and don't know, because you can, like the Viva, you can kind of dig a bit deeper. I know the jury's out as well. So two people who I respect as having well thought through views on the use of AI. On the one hand, I saw Adam Boxter being very critical of AI's attempt to ask chemistry questions. In the same day that Dan, who was on our last show, has shared with me an AI tutor. They had fed his notes so that it was an electronic version of him. And I asked it to talk me through the states of matter and a few chemistry questions, and it seemed to work. So where do you think it's at the moment? Is it ready to go, or are we still a bit early?
I wouldn't claim, Ben, to know enough about it to know what the
Yeah.
state of this is. One thing that does strike me though is if you go down the route of personalized assessment, the thing you might lose is the comparative nature of it. And one of the things we know about students psychologically is that they do tend to judge the success in an assessment compared to their peers. And they're really aware of their place in the pecking order. And so could be a good thing, could be a bad thing, but that could be
It's a
lost.
significant thing, isn't it? Because that actually brings up another thing that you kind of thought about more before. I think one of the lines in your pieces on assessment says that teenage brains are a bit like an investment engine, and there's that concept helps understand how a student approaches and gains or loses motivation from an assessment. Is that something you could unpack a little?
Yeah, sure. So we borrowed this idea of an investment engine from Peps for Career, and it's essentially taking a very simple bit of motivation theory, which is about expectations. So the theory effectively is that if you value the reward, if you expect to be able to achieve the reward, and if you know how to get there, then you're more likely to be motivated. So whilst as a piece of motivation theory, it has its limitations, actually for teachers, it's quite a useful way to think about the human mind, because people will only generally expend effort if they feel they have the ability to achieve a goal and if they think the goal is worthwhile. So if you look at it that way, the task of the teacher is to increase the student's perception of the value of the goal, is to convince them that they can achieve the goal, and then is to minimize the amount of effort that they need to expend to achieve it.
And therefore that might have implications for the kind of assessments I use. So my thinking would be a test that's super difficult, where most of the class perceive they failed, could be a bit of an own goal. Is that right, or am I misunderstanding the concept?
No, I think that's right, and this is the argument, isn't it, for lots of low stakes, high success assessments. So you build up momentum in assessments so that students feel what they've been asked to do is achievable. They experience success. We know that people who experience success become more motivated generally, rather than the other way around. So lots of low stakes, high success assessment builds up resilience for when you do something that is a bit more high stakes and where students won't get, kind of 8, 9 out of 10 necessarily.
So we could spend the whole show talking about assessment, and it seems like there's a lot to dig into. So we might have to revisit this in a later show. I did come across a line that I thought made me think, because I was surprised when I first read it. So maybe you can help it with this. So in one of the pieces you've shared, you and Becky say you don't think that the concepts or the categories of summative and formative assessment are helpful as distinct categories. And it's language that we as teachers use all the time. So I thought, well, let's tell us about that. So if we said, Matt Evans says summative and formative assessment are not useful words to use. That's not nuanced enough. So correct me. And then can you try to unpack that a little?
Okay. So we had a bit of pushback on that, probably fairly. I mean, one of the things you do in blogs is you put out some ideas and hope that people engage with them and push back. I think the reason we made this argument is that going back to that idea that the point of assessment is to promote learning, there aren't two categories of assessments. There aren't assessments where you make inferences and that improves learning, and then assessments where you make inferences and nothing happens. So our contention would be that all assessments both summarize something about what students know, and also will form something. So they will actually influence what happens next, either because it changes the student's self-concept, or because their parents get cross that they haven't done well enough, so they make them stay in over the weekend and do some more work, or whatever it is. But all assessment must be both summative and formative. So our argument really is talking in that language isn't necessarily helpful, because it means that if we call something summative, we are not accepting that it does change human behavior. And if we call it formative, well, that's all assessment, because all assessment has some kind of effect.
What that made me think about is how sometimes I'm a bit uncaring with summative assessments. Maybe because of the language. So because I think of them as this is just the end point, it doesn't lead to any new actions. It's kind of the end. So a mock exam, giving the grade back, just give it back. Maybe don't think enough about that impact upon the student and the context at home and what it's going to lead to next. So I think that's a useful reminder. And then with summative assessments, you said that I think it's sometimes we then devalue their validity or the inferences. So if I'm thinking of what I would think of as a summative assessment, maybe a quiz that students complete in class, I think if it is just summative, what am I neglecting or overlooking when I do that? No, back a step. I'm thinking it's just formative. I've just done a quick quiz. So I've mangled my language, haven't I? Done a quick quiz. It's given me some ideas, but I'm thinking, well, it's just a formative assessment. What do I overlook or miss when I think of it like that?
We tend to think that summative assessments are big and that validity is really, really important. But when we're looking at small formative assessments, somehow validity isn't important. But actually, validity is important in both of those. So I think we've got to be careful with formative assessment that we don't say, well, it's just a 10 question test. It doesn't mean much. It should mean something, because it should provide an insight into what students know, and it should change their behavior in some way. So I don't think we should underestimate the importance of validity. But one more thing about validity, which is when we often talk about validity with assessment, we talk about things like construct validity. So does the assessment tell us something valid about what we think students know? The other way of looking at validity is consequential validity. And consequential validity is, does the test or the assessment do the thing we want it to do? And if we think of assessment as being a tool for improving cognition, for motivating, for changing student self-perception, validity is, does the assessment do that? Not just does it tell us something valid about what students know.
Does that make us think more carefully about just using GCSE style assessments during a course then?
Yes, it does. I mean, there are all sorts of reasons why we shouldn't use GCSE questions very much. I think a stronger argument for that is that they're not designed to be diagnostic. So GCSE questions are designed to say the student knows that or they don't. You either get the mark or you don't, generally speaking. But actually, what it doesn't tell you is why students didn't get the answer correct. So where you see teachers using exam questions throughout, let's say GCSE or A level, as a means by which to learn more about what students know and what they don't know, they are really poor tools. And we need to be really careful about using them for that purpose.
So, well, I feel we've just touched the surface, but it sounds like there's lots we could think about and improve when it comes to how we use assessment in school. Is there one other thing, area, question, or kind of strategy you think this one's big, and maybe schools that you've been in at least or experienced don't think about it enough?
Yeah, so I'm gonna draw on complexity for that, Ben. So one of the things we do in schools, we design an assessment system, and school leaders what they mean by that is how many times do we do something in the exam hall and put it in a spreadsheet and do something with that data. So school leaders, I think, can be quite guilty of thinking of assessment as quite a rigid, formal system. Assessment actually is the sum total of everything that happens in the school to do with assessment. And that happens every lesson, throughout the lesson, throughout the school day. It has a cumulative effect over time. And no one person actually understands the assessment ecosystem. So I think school leaders should be more, to have more humility about the fact that actually they're not in control of assessment, and there is loads that happens in the school that they have no chance of actually understanding on their own. And actually the sum total of all of that activity is probably much more powerful and important than the end of year exams that they spend a lot of time worrying about.
So I'm going to repeat that because there's a lot there, and you can tell me if I've missed something crucial. So what it sounds like is, if I, as a school leader, think I've got a clear handle on my assessment system, and that handle is, yes, we do mock assessment, I don't know, end of year exams, year 7 through 11, and we do 2 mock exams of year 13, and they're reported to parents like this, I've missed the far bigger picture, which is rather more complex, to say the least, involves all the things that teachers do, and is impossible to fully know. Is that what you've just said, or have I misunderstood?
That's perfect, Ben. And I
Okay,
think the implication of
cool.
that is that we, all of those, I think particularly where you look at human behavior, the
Yeah.
combined effect of assessment on a child, on how they see themselves, on the story they tell themselves about how good they are at subjects, how good they are at school, what they're going to do in the future. All of those things are really worthwhile getting beneath the surface of and unpacking.
So individual students, that the stories that they find they're telling themselves about themselves will be shaped much more by that big complex beast you explained, more than the simple version I have in my head as a school leader. So that's a big deal.
Yes.
And needs listening to.
It definitely needs listening to. And we can't claim to understand the impact of assessment unless we listen to what students say about how they experience assessment.
Okay, so a couple of things have come out. So you're shortly moving to a executive role. So you've worked through the different leadership roles within schools, and we started section 1 with a reminder about how communication is crucial and often goes wrong. And we're just transitioning from session 2 with a reminder we really need to listen. So I'm finding it how I always learn from the shows. This is helpful. So we're going to move on to our third section in just a moment, where we kind of find out a bit more about your story. And the first question is going to be, how did you get to here? What is your story? We're going to hear a bit more about your journey into the role you're in and what you're moving into. So I'm going to throw that question up and then give you a bit of time to think about it while I share a message from our sponsors. So a reminder that the show is brought to us by 2 groups today. So Kielo Edu, which is a BET Award winning tool for inclusive classroom discussion. It's free as well. Students can use it to instantly and simultaneously create an interactive map of a discussion, which can help deepen their subject knowledge and provide them the opportunity to think deeply about something quite complex. There are already 1 million people, educators and students, using this, and you can access it for free at kielo-edu.com. And then secondly, John Catt, also sponsor the show. That's John Catt Educational, publishes a range of books about education and professional development. And you can visit their website, johncattbookshop.com. And there's 2 T's in Cat. And if you use the code JCTTR2425, you get 20% off your order. So a good thing to make use of. Hopefully that's given Matthew enough time to come up with his story. So Matt, how did you get here? What's your story?
Well, it's probably really boring, Ben, because I've done like a really linear route to where I am now. So, I was a teacher, I was a head of department, I was an assistant head, and so on. So that bit of it is probably not of great interest to your readers. But I was thinking, listeners rather, I was thinking a little bit more about what has driven me forward, because my motivation really comes from a couple of things. So I get really easily bored. So when people say, "Oh, you're a head, you're now going to be a CEO, you must be really ambitious," I'm not actually that ambitious. Certainly not interested in money or power or status particularly. But I do get really bored. So the thing that's always driven me on to a new challenge is when I get to a point where I think, well, I've done probably 80% of that. So what's the next thing? And I think the other thing about my career, I suppose, is I don't like being told what to do. So I've always sought out positions where no one tells me what to do. I shouldn't admit that publicly, should I?
So I don't know. So
Um,
from the outside, what looks like a successful realization of ambition to have control over lots of people and schools, you're saying, no, I just get bored, and I'd rather not be told what to do, and that's what's made me the man I am today. Is this the
yeah,
story?
I think that's it, and I think too much as well. So I'm actually weirdly for a head teacher, I'm quite an introvert. I live in my head quite a lot, and I spend a lot of time thinking about stuff. And actually, that's been quite useful in leadership because I think a lot of school leaders maybe don't think enough before they do things. So that
Okay.
has also been really helpful.
Is it sometimes harder as well? So you, for example, there's a world where I head home from school thinking I'm in charge of assessment, and I know it. I know it because I know when our exams are and I know our reporting system. And you've said, no, 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 no. It's massively complex. You could never expect to fully understand it. I don't know if that's helpful for me to know. Is it?
Yeah, probably
So,
not. It's probably really unhelpful, but it's certainly the way my mind works. And I think probably I wake up, people wake up in the middle of the night with anxieties, don't they? When I wake up in the middle of the night, I'm usually thinking about something really arcane and ridiculous. Um, but I don't know. I went through a time where I think that probably did get me down. I think I went through a phase of my headship, certainly, where I kind of became a bit, what's the bloody point? Because this is really difficult, and no one in the powers that be really understand how challenging and difficult this is. So why
yeah.
am I bothering? And I think I came through the other side of that maybe about 5 years ago, and thought, just accept your limitations, accept what you can't control, and actually quite you can begin to quite enjoy really unpacking difficult educational problems and accepting that you're not entirely in control. So I think you can come to terms with it, but I do appreciate some people might find it like really depressing.
So I might be a few years behind then. Maybe this is what it is. I know we've come across when Oliver Wendell Holmes before. And when I'm feeling less pessimistic, I think he said the same thing as you when he talks about the far side of complexity. Like you don't want to live ignorant of complexity. But if you dwell on it or get frustrated or wish that it wasn't there, that's just wears you down. But it sounds like you've, at least some of the time, you're the other side of it, where you go, no, you can still do simple things well. You can have an influence, even though the system is complex and we can never hope to fully understand it. That's quite an optimistic take, isn't it? So
Yeah,
this is good.
I think it's okay because you can only do what you can do. So once you kind of accept that and start to think, well, what is it I'm trying to achieve? And let's be open-minded. Let's listen to other people's perspectives. Let's hold our ideas quite lightly. When you get to that point, it can be quite liberating because you no longer have the entire weight of running a school on your shoulders. You realize that you're not
You,
actually omnipotent.
yes, I guess the positive spin of the assessment system is I'm not responsible and can't hope to control the whole thing. That's quite liberating. So now what I'm going to do, and that brings us to our next question. So I feel like what a person thinks they're doing in their role, so the story they tell themselves, can shape their days and weeks and months and years. So you've started to unpack what you think you are doing. So in your current headship role, what do you think you are doing?
So it's probably quite different in my headship role to what I'm going to be doing when I take the CEO role. What I think I'm doing as a head teacher is um, to really get beneath why the school is the way it is. So to understand as much as we can causation, how have we got to this point? Really properly understanding how people perceive the problems that the school faces, not assuming that the way I perceive it is the correct way, and then sort of exploring with people ways to improve the school, um, but being really mindful that we can't come up with like a 2 or 3 year plan and stick to it. It's got to be iterative. you've got to keep coming back to it and going, well, what worked? What didn't work? What do we do now? So a sort of hypothesis testing approach to school leadership, I suppose, is the way I see my role now, and supporting other school leaders in getting through to the other side of complexity. So going from that place where they see everything as being quite linear and simple, and getting deep into the problems and into the emotions of that problem as well. And why is this so difficult? Why are we not moving things? And then helping them to get to a point where they realize what they can do and how they can exercise their influence effectively.
So it sounds like it's a fascinating role, and I'm wondering whether it sounds a bit design-like. So it seems like am I right? I may misremember this, that you started before getting into schools. Was design or architecture something you were pursuing, or am I completely misremembering that?
I would love to be an architect, Ben, but I never
Is there nothing,
was.
none of that? You didn't go to university to study design or
I messed around
advertising?
with a bit of marketing. Yeah, I did do that.
Okay.
For a while, unless if the 90s recession hadn't hit when it did, I might have ended up as one of those people who invents ridiculous adverts or something like that.
Okay, yeah, so maybe I'm not completely, I've just got a very mangled memory, but that concept, it seems like you had to have quite a nimble mind to be a head teacher. You've got to keep reframing the problem and the question and keep listening and then keep communicating and then keep checking. Is there anything you can do to build that muscle, as it were? So listeners are thinking about moving up into a higher leadership role.
Yeah.
What can we do to retain that kind of ability to think nimbly and not get bogged down in responsibility for things that we can't fully control or get fixed ideas?
Yeah, so I think some of the work, many people would have heard of Neil Gilbride, his thinking on this area of complexity and leadership.
I'm going to have to pause you there again, and we'll hear more on that. He was our previous guest just last week. So this is working well. Well, no, it was a one-off episode. He's written this book about self-efficacy, so
yeah,
we can hear more there. We didn't talk much about his complexity theory. So what is it about his explorations of a complexity that's kind of helpful for school leaders to think about?
Yeah, so Neil and I did a project together on looking at how you do this stuff with school leaders, and without going into it in any detail, but essentially it is finding ways to get school leaders to appreciate how complex educational problems can be, recognizing that something's complex, how you consider the complexity, how you seek various perspectives, how you bring people on with you. So yeah, I think there's some really interesting work going on, and Neil, I know, is doing some great work on this with Ambition Institute, and I think he's working with one of the big multi-academy trusts as well, on how you get leaders to cope with complexity and hold uncertainty in leadership more effectively.
That's really helpful, because I feel that sometimes when, as a leader in a school, we forget or overlook that, we end up peddling a simplistic story that can be kind of unhelpful or misleading.
Hi secondary school teachers, we're Apps for Good, and we give schools like yours free introductory computing courses. Our courses are for everyone, including those who aren't computing teachers, and they're fully equipped with resources mapped to the UK computing curriculums. Independent learning is central to our courses. Your students will develop essential and digital skills by working in teams to create prototype apps. We'll even connect you with industry volunteers to give real-world feedback. Let's empower every young person you teach to shape their future with technology. Speak to us at www.appsforgood.org.
Did you know that every year, half of disadvantaged children who are top attainers at primary school don't go on to achieve top GCSE maths results? At Axiom Maths, we exist to change that. Our fully funded programme helps schools nurture young mathematicians through weekly face-to-face maths circles, where pupils tackle challenging and exciting problems outside the national curriculum. With just under £3,000 annual funding, expert training and quality resources, we give schools everything they need to inspire the next generation of mathematical thinkers. Want to make a difference? Visit axiommaths.com today and join over 400 schools delivering maths circles across the UK.
Meet 2025 BET Award winner Kialo EDU, the 100% free tool for thoughtful, inclusive classroom discussion. On Kialo, students contribute instantly and simultaneously to create an interactive map of a discussion, deepening their subject knowledge and enhancing their critical thinking skills. Set tasks, track participation, and provide personalized feedback in just a few clicks. And since it's compatible with all your favorite LMS platforms, it slots seamlessly into your existing workflow. Over 1 million educators and students are already using Kialo to make the world a more thoughtful place. Join them today at kialo-edu.com.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
And that kind of leads us to our next line of questions. So I'm always interested in where you are in your career now. You will have been told some tall tales, maybe some simple stories about what you should do, about how schools worked, that on reflection they weren't true and or they weren't helpful. Have you got any examples of those?
Yeah, I mean, I've done so much nonsense in my time, Ben. So, I got told for a long while, I think probably by Tony Blair, that the point of education was to prepare people for the world of work and to drive the economy and all of these things. And I kind of regret a lot of the things I did in the 90s, really, and early 2000s. And I think one of the jobs I had, which I think I did pretty well, actually. In fact, I won an award for it, and that's how well I did it. But now I kind of think I wish I'd never done it, was I was in charge of enterprise learning in a specialist academy. And I did a lot of stuff where I would go to teachers and heads of department and say, you should embed enterprise in your lesson. And an English teacher or a history teacher would look at me and go, yeah, I don't think I should. And I'd do my best to convince them it was a brilliant idea. But they were actually right. They shouldn't have done. They should have taught history or English. So I really regret that. But we all get caught up in these narratives, don't we, and ideas for what we think education is for.
So I remember thinking this early in my career, and it still happens, even though I wish I'd kind of grow out of it, where there are things I was doing in year one of teaching that were deeply important to me. One of them was ensuring that my slides had washed out images that matched the theme, and lots of things that took lots of time. And I remember telling a class, teachers shouldn't talk, so I've only got 4 minutes of talking time today. I'm going to use a stopwatch, and that's all we get. And it was great, and I was praised for it. And I look back and think, what was I doing? But that just happens. Has it stopped happening yet?
No.
It just keeps happening.
It keeps happening. And the thing I found interesting is not looking back and thinking, what on earth was I doing? Because I think we're always going to do that. What I find interesting is, what do we firmly believe now?
Yes,
in
that's
10 or 20 years' time, are we going to think, why did you go on the radio show and say that was a good idea?
Yes. Have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah,
so
no. It's hard to see, isn't it?
It is hard
in
to
the
see.
present.
Yes.
So I think we might be there with we might be at a tipping point with cognitive science, and this is not before people leap on Twitter. This is not to say cognitive science is not useful.
So we can't drum up listeners by saying Matt Evans says cognitive science is a fad and we've moved beyond it.
Well, I kind of think we're starting to move beyond it, in the sense that we can value it but not think it is everything. And you are starting to see voices coming out to say, I mean, a great example of this is, we know cognitive science is really effective at telling us how one person learns, but it's not very effective at telling us how a class of 30 people learn. For that, we need to understand social psychology. So where's social psychology in the discourse? Or where's organizational theory? Or
one place we could find it is last week's show. Social learning theory it was Bandura, and what I really liked about it, this is what Neil was saying, that it's social learning theory brings the emotional landscape of the classroom back into teachers' minds.
Yeah.
And what I find weird is I thought I was working these things out myself. So I think I agree with you. I have cognitive psychology and cognitive science and some of those principles and mechanisms really helpful, but they're just one story and it's not enough. And maybe
No.
we're missing things. But I feel like I'm working that out myself. But the system is learning it, so it's not me, is it? It's just
No, because we can't think independently of the system.
No.
Can we? So we can't really. You and I, Ben, unfortunately, can't have original ideas.
They're not our
very
ideas,
often.
are they? We're just being swept along by
We're being
the
swept
flow.
along. The next,
But they're good
wave.
things, but we can influence it a bit, can't we? So I'm trying to grab on. Okay, so emotional landscape, helpful idea. Cognitive psychology, don't let it all go out with the bathwater. There's lots of good in there as well. Apart from cognitive psychology, which you've said is a fad and we've moved on from.
I haven't said that.
No, you haven't. Just for the show, Matt didn't say that, but if we want to use that as anyway. So
Yeah.
is there anything else you think we're moving on from this one as well? There might not be.
No, I think there is. So I'm certainly picking up amongst school leaders that I work with. So I do some work in other schools outside of my own currently. I'm picking up a little bit around the popular approaches to behaviour management, and I think this is actually more of a swing of the pendulum. So there is definitely, I'm sensing a swing away from what have been portrayed as behaviourist approaches and building good routines, habits, clear consequences, and there's definitely a swing back towards, I suppose, what some people would call a more progressive approach of considering emotions and social and emotional aspects of learning. So I'm not going to comment on whether that's a good thing, but I think it is happening.
Okay, so we've got in areas that you think might change or seem like they are over the next kind of few years as you move into your new role. One is the looking beyond cognitive psychology, and I like to go on record as saying you didn't say it was a fad we've moved on from, and that's fine. And then secondly, there seems to be a pendulum shift around the rhetoric and language and explanations of behavior, moving from behaviorism to something that's more
it's inevitable, isn't it? Because
yes,
it's an obvious response to the fallout from the pandemic and from social media that we talked about earlier, where students aren't coming into school, or they are coming in and are truanting internally, or they're not truanting, but they're not paying any attention to the teacher. So all of these things make us think more about why students are behaving in that way, and that therefore leads us down the route of social emotional considerations.
And we can't get a hot take on that because it's a complex one. But I'm inferring from that maybe there's a midpoint that's more balanced, but who knows? Who knows? Another one that I think who knows is where we're at. Although my finger isn't fully on the pulse, is Ofsted is shifting. Do you have any thoughts on what that will do, or is there just not enough out there to know?
But my instinct is that it's not a good shift.
Okay.
And let's loop back to assessment here.
Yeah, I thought there might be a link there, and validity of inferences, but
validity of inference and consequential validity.
But we're having the same ideas because we're in the same stream. They're not our ideas.
That's exactly it. They're not original. But it's impossible to make valid inferences on the current framework in a couple of days. If you increase the number of grades and the number of areas they're judging, then logically the validity of inferences must be lower. I think it's going to be substantially lower. And I think if we then look at the consequential validity of that, we've got the expectation of inference. So how does the system behave when it expects to be judged?
Yes.
And then what effect does it have on self-concept of schools once they've been judged? And we go round in a circle again, don't we, with ignoring the behavioural human motivational effects of the accountability system because we are hung up on making judgments.
So I'm not sure what I think on this yet, but I was at the ASCL conference the other day when Martin Oliver said, we don't expect you to do anything just for us. And he paused, and the whole room erupted in laughter. And
Yeah.
I laughed loud, and I laughed twice. I did, because I thought that's just not how it works.
No.
And then I remember going the previous framework. I remember sitting at one of the briefings about the evidence base where they shared book scrutiny. They'd actually done something that was a bit like inter-rater reliability of looking at students' work, and it was really quite low. If you were going to base a high stakes judgment on it, it's no worse than judging essays, which is kind of 50-50, it turns out. And I've just put those things together and thought, well,
Yeah.
there's a problem, isn't there? There's you making 15 judgments. Will we have published findings on how in the inter-rater reliability? So what are the odds that a second Ofsted inspector with the same material on the same day is going to come to the same judgment? And if we're not having that information, why not? Because I suspect it's just not good enough.
We wouldn't, if we make a comparison to GCSE, well, if we're looking at assessment, you wouldn't say we're going to have a GCSE or an A-level exam system and we don't expect anyone to prepare for it.
No,
It
you
just
wouldn't,
doesn't
because
happen.
we've just spent 20 minutes talking about what was the language you used. I scribbled it down. The third thing about assessments, expectation of inference. Like, we're doing
Yeah.
it because we want to change behavior.
Yes.
So that's an interesting thing. And then secondly, I'm thinking I'm not going to grade every question, because when I do that, madness ensues. You don't get a grade on an essay, you get a grade on the paper as a whole, because the aggregate is more significant than the, oh dear.
Yeah, it's well, let's not go down that rabbit
No,
hole,
let's not.
because
So we're going to leave that. So we're finishing on a positive note. So I have enjoyed hearing your thoughts on assessment, school leadership, and I'm getting some themes that are communication is key, and it often goes wrong. You've got to listen, you've got to communicate clearly. You've got to find a way of living with complexity that doesn't get you down, because the fact that schools are complex is just a fact. It's not our fault. And it's not avoidable. So that's been quite encouraging. And then we always finish with what keeps you going. So have you got a little lift to finish? what keeps you going, Matt?
Yeah, well, I was initially I thought irritation, because I get irritated by things, but I'm not.
Yeah.
That isn't a positive for this.
No, because we've done a bit of that, and that was cathartic. So
that was great. Let's move on. So let's go parables. So the one that always comes back to me is the one with the sun and the wind and the guy with his raincoat on. You know the one I mean. And I think it's easy in schools to be the wind.
Can we tell it, just in case? Because I think I do, but
so essentially
listeners might not.
You've got a competition between the sun and the wind, and there's a man walking along with a raincoat on, and the sun and the wind agree that they're going to have a competition to see who can get the man to take his raincoat off. And the wind is very confident and says, well, you know, I can do this. I can do this easily. I'm gonna blow the wind. I'm gonna rain down the rain, and I'm gonna make it miserable for him. And I'm gonna blow the raincoat off this man. I'm gonna use all of my power and my might. And of course, he tries that, and the more he tries it, the more the man pulls the raincoat tighter and tighter around him. And eventually, the wind gives up and says to the sun, "Well, go on then, see if you can do any better than me." And of course, the sun rays down its rays, and its warmth
shines, doesn't it? Just
shines, and the man goes, "Phew! I want to get this raincoat off, and I want to just soak up the rays of the sun." So that parable to me is really powerful. Whenever you see someone in a school trying to get someone to do something like the wind and the rain, and actually reflecting that if you're more sun, be more sun.
Be more sun
is the moral of the story.
This is good. And I, again, just want to say thanks for your time and the thought you've put into both prepping for the show, and I think the little kind of stories and vignettes and summaries you provided are the product of lots of thinking. So when you've talked about being somebody who thinks a lot, I know you think and write a lot as well. So if I've listened to this show and I think I want to find out more about some of those ideas, where should I go? So where can I contact you, or what do I need to kind of click on or look at?
Go to our Substack, which is called 100% Assessment.
Okay.
And you can contact me through there. All of that stuff on assessment gets released weekly. We've got about 100,000 words of content that we're drip feeding out there. So there's plenty of content there. And you can link from there to my blog as well, where I've got links to all sorts of other stuff. if
And
you're
then
interested in anything.
you mentioned complexity. I mean, there's a book about that, isn't there?
I heard there is, Ben.
Is it a John Catt book?
It is a John Catt
It
book.
is. They're one of our sponsors. So
They
if
are,
people wanted to buy that book,
they would go to the John Catt website,
They would.
not to other providers.
They
It would
wouldn't.
go straight
No.
to John Catt.
Yes, because they get a discount, wouldn't they? They get a 20% discount with JCT TTR 2425. So thanks again to Matt, and thank you very much to our sponsors. So Kielo Edu, who provide that mechanism for instantaneous free debate and discussion, and to John Catt, who published a range of fascinating books, including the book which Matt has written. I have with myself, so I slightly over-egged that there, and Professor Becky Allen, and you can find that and other books on the website. So thanks again, Matt. We look forward to hearing people's responses to today's show, and I'd like to just repeat on record, you had a very nuanced view upon the role of cognitive psychology in education and didn't claim that it was a fad that we've moved on from, and this is good. So thanks again.
Thanks, Ben.
Enjoy the rest of your time as head teacher, and good luck in the new role when it kicks off in September.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks to our listeners, and we'll be back next month with Damien McBeath, and we're going to be exploring his experience working in a range of schools and what he thinks schools business is or should be when it comes to the kind of smartphone debate. So hopefully we'll have similar interesting discussions and debates there. So thanks very much to all, and we look forward to hearing from listeners, maybe a few questions in our next show. Good night.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.